The sun beat down relentlessly on the dusty streets of Silverridge, Colorado, as Elizabeth Foster clutched her worn leather coin purse tightly against her chest. The summer of 1878 had been unforgiving, the drought stretching into its third month, leaving the once prosperous mining town desperate for relief. Elizabeth's dress, once a vibrant blue calico, had faded to a pale shadow of its former self, much like her hopes since arriving out west 6 months ago. The bell above Miller's General Store jangled as Elizabeth pushed open the heavy wooden door. The familiar scent of coffee beans, leather, and tobacco greeted her, a momentary respite from the dust and despair outside. Her stomach growled painfully, a reminder of the 2 days since her last proper meal. The 3 copper pennies in her purse, all that remained of her savings, weighed like lead. "Morning, Miss Foster," old Mr. Miller called from behind the counter, his spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose. "What can I help you with today?" Elizabeth forced a smile. "Just a loaf of bread, please, Mr. Miller." She placed the pennies on the counter, praying it would be enough. Her fingers, once soft and delicate from her life in Boston, were now calloused from the washing and mending she did to survive. Mr. Miller's face fell slightly as he reached for the last loaf on the shelf. "I'm afraid it's 3 cents for the bread now, Miss Foster. Flour shipments have been delayed with the railroad troubles." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. 1 penny short, just one. She stared at the bread, the hunger gnawing at her insides, making her dizzy. "I'll cover it," came a deep voice from behind her. Elizabeth turned to find herself staring at the broad chest of a tall man she'd seen around town but never spoken to. He wore a well-worn leather vest over a simple cotton shirt, his dark hat pulled low over piercing blue eyes. A tanned hand reached past her, placing a coin on the counter. "And whatever else the lady might need," he added. Mr. Miller's eyebrows rose as he took the coin. "That's mighty generous of you, Jacob Galloway." Elizabeth felt her cheeks flush. "I couldn't possibly. No charity, madam," the cowboy said, his voice like gravel but somehow gentle. "Just a proposition." He removed his hat, revealing thick chestnut hair that curled slightly at his collar. "That bread looks mighty lonely for a meal. Eat with me instead." The invitation hung in the air between them, unexpected and strange. Elizabeth studied his face, the strong jaw covered in stubble, the slight crinkles at the corners of his eyes, the small scar above his right eyebrow. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way of the Boston men she'd known, but there was something compelling in his direct gaze. "I don't even know you, sir," Elizabeth replied, though her stomach protested the potential refusal of a proper meal. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Jacob Galloway, madam. I run cattle on the North Range, and you're Elizabeth Foster, the woman who's been taking in washing from half the town and mending for the other half." He extended a calloused hand. "Now we're properly acquainted." Despite herself, Elizabeth smiled. "You seem to know quite a bit about me, Mr. Galloway." "Small town," he replied with a shrug. "Hard not to notice a woman working as hard as you do." He gestured toward the door. "I've got stew simmering at my place just on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but it's hot and there's plenty." Elizabeth hesitated. Propriety demanded she refuse. A single woman didn't simply go to a bachelor's home. But hunger was a powerful motivator, and something in Jacob Galloway's straightforward manner told her she'd be safe. "I'll bring the bread," she said finally. Accepting the wrapped loaf from Mr. Miller, Jacob placed his hat back on his head with a nod. "Much obliged, Miss Foster." As they stepped out into the harsh sunlight, Elizabeth felt the curious stares of townsfolk. Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, looked particularly scandalized from across the street. Elizabeth lifted her chin slightly. "Let them talk. They'd talk regardless." "My wagon's just down the way," Jacob said, seemingly oblivious to the attention they were attracting. "Unless you'd prefer to walk." "The wagon is fine," Elizabeth replied, suddenly aware of how tired she truly was. "Thank you, Mr. Galloway." "Jacob," he corrected, offering his arm to help her into the simple farm wagon. "If you're going to eat my cooking, you might as well use my Christian name." The wagon creaked as they set off down the main street, dust swirling behind them. Elizabeth clutched the bread in her lap, wondering what exactly she had gotten herself into. and why the prospect of sharing a meal with this rough-hewn cowboy made her heart beat just a little faster. Jacob's place turned out to be a modest but well-maintained cabin set back from the road, with a small barn and corral behind it. A vegetable garden, surprisingly lush given the drought, spread to one side. Elizabeth noted the windmill pumping water into a large tank, a luxury many in town couldn't afford. "You live here alone?" Elizabeth asked, as Jacob helped her down from the wagon. "Just me and Chester," he replied, gesturing toward an old hound dog who came lumbering around the corner of the house, tail wagging lazily. Elizabeth couldn't help but smile as the dog approached her, sniffing curiously before giving her hand a gentle lick. "He's friendly." "Better judge of character than most people," Jacob said, leading the way to the cabin door. "Chester doesn't take to everyone." The inside of Jacob's home was surprisingly neat for a bachelor. A simple table with 4 chairs occupied one corner near a cast-iron stove where a pot bubbled quietly. Bookshelves lined one wall, unexpected in a cowboy's cabin, and a comfortable-looking chair sat near the fireplace. Everything was clean and orderly, with none of the chaos Elizabeth had expected. "Please sit," Jacob said, gesturing to the table as he moved to the stove. "Hope you don't mind beef stew. Made it yesterday, but it's always better the second day." Elizabeth sank gratefully into a chair, the aroma from the pot making her mouth water. "It smells wonderful." Jacob ladled stew into 2 bowls, placing one before her with a chunk of cornbread on the side. "Not as fancy as what you might be used to back east, but it'll fill the belly." Elizabeth looked up in surprise. "How did you know I'm from back east?" Jacob smiled as he sat across from her. "Your accent, Boston, if I'm not mistaken, plus your manners give you away." "Most women out here don't sit quite so straight." Elizabeth relaxed her posture slightly. "I came from Boston 6 months ago, my parents." She trailed off, the familiar pain surfacing. "You don't have to explain," Jacob said quietly. "Everyone out here is running from something or toward something." Elizabeth took a spoonful of stew, nearly moaning at the rich flavor. "This is delicious," she said, eager to change the subject. "My mother's recipe," Jacob replied. "She taught me to cook before she passed." Said no man should rely on a woman for basic survival. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, Elizabeth trying not to betray how desperately hungry she'd been. Jacob pretended not to notice how quickly her bowl emptied, simply refilling it without comment. "So," Jacob said finally, breaking the bread Elizabeth had brought, "what brought you to Silverridge? Most Easterners heading west stop in Denver or push on to San Francisco." Elizabeth dabbed her mouth with the napkin Jacob had provided, another surprising touch of civilization. "I came to join my brother. He wrote about striking it rich in the silver mines." She stared into her bowl. "By the time I arrived, he'd been dead 3 weeks. Tunnel collapse." Jacob's face softened. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth, the mines are dangerous work." "The worst part was discovering he'd gambled away everything he'd earned," Elizabeth continued, finding it strangely easy to confide in this quiet cowboy. "I arrived expecting to find a home waiting, only to discover I was penniless in a strange town." "Yet you stayed," Jacob observed. Elizabeth nodded. "I couldn't afford the fare back east, and truthfully, there's nothing for me in Boston anymore. My parents died of influenza last year, so I found a room at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house and took in washing. It's been difficult." "You're a survivor," Jacob said with a respect that warmed her more than the stew. "That's something to be proud of." Elizabeth glanced around the cabin. "And what's your story, Jacob Galloway? You seem well established for a young man." Jacob leaned back in his chair. "Not so young. 32 this past spring. I came out here after the war, couldn't settle back into Virginia life after 4 years of fighting. Worked as a ranch hand, saved my money, bought land when others gave up and headed back east. Started with 10 head of cattle and built from there." "You fought in the war?" Elizabeth asked, noting the shadow that crossed his face. "Confederate cavalry," he replied, a hint of challenge in his voice. "Though out here most folks don't much care which side you rode for as long as you work hard and deal fair." Elizabeth nodded. "The war took my father's brother and nearly ruined his business, but that was a long time ago." "Not so long," Jacob said quietly. "Some wounds heal slow." An uncomfortable silence fell between them, broken only when Chester ambled over to rest his head on Elizabeth's lap. She stroked the dog's ears, grateful for the distraction. "He really has taken a shine to you," Jacob observed, the tension easing from his shoulders. "Chester usually keeps his distance with strangers." "I've always loved dogs," Elizabeth replied. "We had a retriever in Boston, but I couldn't bring him west." Jacob stood, collecting their empty bowls. "Would you like coffee? I just got some beans in last supply run." "That would be lovely," Elizabeth said, realizing she'd spent nearly an hour in this man's home and felt more comfortable than she had in months. As Jacob prepared the coffee, Elizabeth studied him surreptitiously. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to physical labor, but there was a gentleness to his movements that belied his rugged exterior. When he reached for cups on a high shelf, she noticed a scar peeking from beneath his sleeve, a reminder of the war he'd mentioned, perhaps. "May I ask you something, Jacob?" Elizabeth ventured as he placed a steaming cup before her. "Seems fair," he replied, settling back into his chair. "I've asked plenty about you. Why did you help me today, with the bread?" Jacob considered her question, taking a sip of his coffee before answering. "Honestly, I've been watching you these past months, seen how hard you work, how you keep your dignity despite circumstances. Admired it." He looked down at his cup. "And maybe I know what it's like to be hungry and proud." Elizabeth felt her cheeks warm under his frank admission. "Well, thank you for the bread and the meal. My pleasure." Jacob's eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Maybe you do me the honor of joining me again sometime. Sunday dinner, perhaps." The proper Boston lady in Elizabeth knew she should refuse. A single woman accepting repeated invitations to a bachelor's home would start tongues wagging even more than they already were. But the independent woman she was becoming in the West saw no reason to deny herself the company of a decent man and a good meal. "I'd like that," she said finally. "But perhaps we should meet in town next time at the hotel restaurant, for propriety's sake." Jacob's slow smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "For a woman who just rode unchaperoned to a stranger's cabin, you're mighty concerned with propriety, Miss Foster." Elizabeth laughed, surprising herself. "I suppose hunger makes improper women of us all, Mr. Galloway." "Jacob," he reminded her, his eyes twinkling. "And I'd be honored to escort you to dinner at the hotel. Sunday at 6. "Sunday at 6, Elizabeth confirmed, finishing her coffee. "But I should be getting back to town now. Mrs. Holloway will be wondering where I've gone." Jacob nodded, rising to help her from her chair. "I'll drive you back." The return journey to town passed quickly, with Jacob pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's early settlement. Elizabeth found herself relaxing in his company, laughing at his dry observations about Silverridge's more colorful characters. "Mrs. Henderson looks like she swallowed a lemon," Jacob murmured as they approached the boarding house where Elizabeth lived. The minister's wife stood on the opposite boardwalk, openly staring. Elizabeth sighed. "She'll have plenty to say about this, I'm sure." "Does that trouble you?" Jacob asked, bringing the wagon to a stop. Elizabeth considered the question. 6 months ago, it would have mortified her to be the subject of gossip. Now, after all she'd endured, it seemed trivial. "Not as much as it probably should," she admitted, "but it might affect my livelihood if women stop bringing me their washing." Jacob nodded thoughtfully. "All the more reason for me to be properly respectful and court you according to the rules." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. "Court me, Mr. Galloway, we've shared precisely one meal." Jacob's smile was slow and sure as he helped her down from the wagon. "Yes, madam." "But I'm hoping for many more." He tipped his hat. "Sunday at 6, I'll be waiting." As Elizabeth watched him drive away, she pressed a hand to her flushed cheek. The day had begun with hunger and 3 copper pennies. It was ending with a full stomach, and the prospect of a proper dinner with a most improper cowboy. Perhaps, she thought as she climbed the steps to her boarding house, the West held possibilities she hadn't considered. Sunday seemed both too far away and approaching too quickly. Elizabeth spent Saturday washing and pressing her best dress, a navy blue cotton with white piping that had survived the journey west relatively intact. Mrs. Holloway raised her eyebrows when Elizabeth mentioned her dinner plans, but offered a cameo brooch to spruce things up a bit. A cattleman, you say? Mrs. Holloway asked as she pinned the brooch to Elizabeth's collar Sunday evening. Jacob Galloway's got a good reputation, keeps to himself mostly, but pays his bills and doesn't carouse like some. We're just having dinner, Mrs. Holloway, Elizabeth replied, trying to downplay her nervousness. The older woman smiled knowingly. Of course, dear, and I just happen to be pressing my best tablecloth for no reason at all. The Silverridge Hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in town, which wasn't saying much compared to Boston standards, but the white tablecloths and polished silverware represented luxury in this frontier setting. Elizabeth arrived precisely at 6, her heart fluttering inexplicably as she spotted Jacob waiting by the entrance. He'd cleaned up impressively, trading his work clothes for a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaved. When he spotted her, his smile transformed his face, erasing the hard lines of a man who worked outdoors and revealing something younger, almost boyish. "Miss Foster," he said, taking her gloved hand. "You look beautiful." Elizabeth felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Galloway. You clean up rather well yourself." "Figured I should make an effort," he replied, offering his arm. "Can't have the finest lady in Silverridge thinking I'm just some rough cowhand." "Just some rough cowhand who reads Shakespeare," Elizabeth replied, nodding toward the small volume visible in his jacket pocket. Jacob looked momentarily embarrassed. "Habit from the trail. Always carry something to read." "I think it's wonderful," Elizabeth said sincerely as he led her to a table by the window. "I've missed books terribly. I had to sell most of mine for the journey west." Jacob held her chair, waiting until she was seated before taking his own place across from her. "My library is modest, but you're welcome to borrow anything that interests you." The dinner that followed was the most pleasant evening Elizabeth had experienced since arriving in Silverridge. Jacob proved to be surprisingly well-read and articulate for a man who spent his days with cattle. He asked thoughtful questions about her life in Boston and listened attentively to her answers. By the time they'd finished their apple pie dessert, Elizabeth had shared more of herself than she'd intended. "My father wanted me to marry his business partner's son," she admitted as Jacob poured her more coffee. "A suitable match by Boston standards, but Herbert was dull," she smiled at the memory. "My brother used to call him Herbert the Horrible behind his back." Jacob chuckled. "I take it you weren't heartbroken to leave him behind." "Hardly. Though I sometimes wonder if I'd be better off now if I'd made that suitable match." Elizabeth sighed. "Poverty has a way of making even dullness seem appealing." "And what about now?" Jacob asked, his voice softening. "Would you go back if you could?" Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "Despite everything, there's something about the West that suits me. The openness, the possibilities. In Boston, my path was predetermined. Here I can become whatever I choose to become." "And what do you choose, Elizabeth Foster?" Jacob's blue eyes held her steadily. She smiled, surprising herself with her answer. "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I think I'd like to find out." The next few weeks passed in a pleasant routine. Jacob called on Elizabeth every Sunday for dinner at the hotel, and occasionally during the week, he'd appear at her door with fresh vegetables from his garden, or a book he thought she might enjoy. Elizabeth found herself looking forward to his visits, planning what she might wear or which stories she might share. True to Mrs. Holloway's prediction, tongues wagged about Elizabeth's gentleman caller, but the gossip was more curious than malicious. Jacob Galloway was respected in the community, and his obvious courtship lent Elizabeth a certain status she hadn't enjoyed before. "Mrs. Henderson actually smiled at me yesterday," Elizabeth told Jacob one Sunday evening as they strolled through town after dinner. "Last month she crossed the street to avoid speaking to me." Jacob's laugh rumbled pleasantly. "Amazing what a difference respectability makes." "Is that what you're giving me, Jacob? Respectability?" Elizabeth teased. He stopped walking, turning to face her in the golden light of sunset. "I hope I'm giving you much more than that, Elizabeth." The sincerity in his voice made her breath catch. Over the past weeks, their conversations had grown deeper, more personal. She told him about her parents' deaths, the crushing loneliness that had made her eager to join her brother out west. He'd shared stories of the war, of the nightmares that still sometimes woke him, of his dream to build something lasting on his land. "You are," she said softly. "You've given me friendship when I most needed it." Jacob stepped closer, his hand gently taking hers. "Is friendship all you want from me, Elizabeth?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibility. Elizabeth looked up into his face, now so familiar, so dear to her, and knew the truth. "No," she whispered, "not just friendship." Jacob's smile was tender as he leaned down, his lips brushing hers in a kiss so gentle it might have been the touch of a butterfly's wing. Elizabeth closed her eyes, savoring the moment, the warmth that spread through her having nothing to do with the summer evening. When he pulled away, his eyes were dark with emotion. "I've been wanting to do that since you walked into my cabin with that loaf of bread." Elizabeth laughed softly, feeling lighter than she had in years. "That was only a month ago, Jacob." "Felt like a lifetime," he replied, offering his arm to continue their walk. "I'm not a patient man by nature." As summer turned to autumn, Elizabeth found herself falling deeply in love with Jacob Galloway. His strength and gentleness, his unexpected depth, the way he looked at her as if she were precious, all of it combined to heal wounds she hadn't realized were still open. October brought cattle buyers to the region, and Jacob was busy with the fall roundup. Elizabeth missed their Sunday dinners, though he still managed to visit at least once a week, often arriving dust-covered and exhausted but determined to see her. "You should rest," she admonished one evening when he appeared at the boarding house after riding 15 miles from his range camp. "I am resting," he replied, settling into Mrs. Holloway's parlor chair. "Just being near you restores me." Such simple declarations of affection never failed to warm Elizabeth's heart. Jacob wasn't a man of flowery words or grand gestures, but his consistent care spoke volumes. On a crisp November afternoon, Jacob invited Elizabeth to ride out to his ranch. "There's something I want to show you," he said, a nervousness in his manner she hadn't seen before. "Mrs. Holloway insisted on sending her young nephew along as a chaperone, though the boy promptly fell asleep in the back of the wagon as they journeyed out of town. "He's a very effective guardian," Elizabeth laughed, nodding toward the snoring 12-year-old. Jacob smiled, but his usual easy manner seemed strained. "Elizabeth," he began, then stopped, staring straight ahead at the road. "Is something wrong?" she asked, suddenly worried. He shook his head. "No, just, I'm not good with words when they matter most." They rode in silence until the familiar shape of Jacob's cabin appeared on the horizon. But instead of turning toward it, Jacob guided the horses down a side trail Elizabeth hadn't noticed before. After a few minutes, they crested a small hill, revealing a spectacular view of the valley below, golden in the autumn sunlight. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth breathed as Jacob helped her down from the wagon, careful not to disturb the sleeping chaperone. "This is my favorite spot on the whole property," Jacob said, leading her to a flat rock where they could sit and admire the vista. "I come here to think." "And what do you think about?" Elizabeth asked, admiring the way the sunlight caught in his hair. Jacob turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "Lately, you, only you." Elizabeth's heart began to race as Jacob slid from the rock to one knee before her. "Elizabeth Foster, I know I'm not the kind of man you were raised to expect. I'm rough around the edges, stubborn as they come, and I wake up some nights still fighting a war that ended 13 years ago." He paused, his hands tightening on hers. "But I love you with everything I am. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes as joy bubbled up inside her. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Jacob, I will." His smile was brilliant as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small gold ring set with a modest diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slid it onto her finger. "I've been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the courage to ask." "It's perfect," Elizabeth said, admiring the way it caught the light. Then she leaned forward, placing her hands on either side of his face, and kissed him with all the love that had grown in her heart since that day in Miller's General Store. The sound of a theatrical cough interrupted them. Young Tommy Holloway stood a few yards away, looking both embarrassed and amused. "Aunt Marjorie said I was supposed to keep an eye on you two," he announced. Jacob laughed, rising to his feet and helping Elizabeth up. Well, Tommy, you can tell your aunt that Miss Foster has just agreed to become Mrs. Galloway. Think that'll satisfy her." The boy's eyes widened. "You're getting married. Can I be the one to tell everybody?" Elizabeth exchanged an amused glance with Jacob. "I suppose news will spread faster that way. There's one more thing I wanted to show you," Jacob said as they walked back to the wagon. He pointed to a cleared area just beyond the rise. "I've been building something these past few weeks." As they approached, Elizabeth could see the foundation and framing of what appeared to be a house much larger than Jacob's cabin. "Our home," Jacob said quietly. "If you approve, 2 stories with a proper parlor for entertaining and 4 bedrooms upstairs. 4 bedrooms." Elizabeth asked, emotion making her voice unsteady. Jacob's expression grew tender. "For our family, the one I hope we'll have together." Elizabeth's vision blurred with tears as she looked from the half-built house to the man beside her. From 3 copper pennies and a loaf of bread to this moment it seemed impossible, yet perfectly right. "It's wonderful, Jacob," she said, squeezing his hand. "Everything I could wish for." They were married 3 weeks later in Silverridge's small church. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, even Mrs. Henderson, who had become one of Elizabeth's most loyal customers once her engagement was announced. "Never thought I'd see Jacob Galloway settled down," the blacksmith commented to anyone who would listen. "That woman must have some powerful magic." Elizabeth wore a new dress of ivory silk that Jacob had ordered from Denver, with Mrs. Holloway's cameo brooch as her something borrowed. Jacob looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a new suit, his usual weathered hat replaced by a brushed felt derby for the occasion. "You look beautiful," he whispered as she joined him before the minister. "So do you," she whispered back, loving the way his eyes crinkled when he tried not to laugh during a serious moment. Their vows were simple but heartfelt. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed her with a restrained passion that still managed to scandalize some of the older church ladies. The reception at the hotel was the social event of the season in Silverridge. Everyone brought dishes to share, and Mr. Miller contributed several bottles of his finest whiskey. There was dancing and laughter, with even the most reserved townspeople joining in the celebration. "Happy, Mrs. Galloway?" Jacob asked as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Elizabeth replied honestly. "And you, Mr. Galloway, any regrets about paying for that loaf of bread?" Jacob's arms tightened around her. "Best investment I ever made." Later that night, after they'd said their goodbyes and traveled to Jacob's ranch, their ranch now, Elizabeth stood in the doorway of the cabin, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her here. "Welcome home," Jacob said, lifting her into his arms to carry her over the threshold. "This is just temporary," Elizabeth reminded him, glancing toward the window where the frame of their new house was visible in the moonlight. "Our real home is still under construction." Jacob set her down gently in the middle of the cabin, now adorned with fresh curtains Elizabeth had sewn and a new quilt on the bed. "Home isn't the building, Elizabeth. It's wherever we're together." As his lips found hers in the lamplight, Elizabeth knew he was right. Home wasn't Boston or Silverridge, or even the beautiful house being built on the hill. Home was here, in Jacob Galloway's arms, where she had found love when she least expected it. Winter settled over Colorado with a vengeance that year. Heavy snow isolated the ranch for days at a time, but Elizabeth found she didn't mind. The cabin was snug and warm, and the forced intimacy of their first months of marriage allowed them to learn each other in ways that might have taken longer under different circumstances. Jacob taught Elizabeth to cook on the cantankerous wood stove, laughing at her early disasters but eating everything she prepared with apparent enjoyment. She taught him to mend his own clothes properly, rather than the haphazard stitching he'd been doing for years. They read Shakespeare aloud by the fire in the evenings, Jacob's deep voice bringing the characters to life in a way Elizabeth had never experienced. They shared stories of their childhoods, dreams for the future, and slowly built the foundation of a life together as sturdy as the walls of the house taking shape on the hill. When the snow melted enough for travel, Jacob insisted on taking Elizabeth into town for supplies and a visit with Mrs. Holloway, the boarding housekeeper, embraced Elizabeth warmly. Married life agrees with you, she declared, noting Elizabeth's rosy cheeks and bright eyes. You're positively glowing. Elizabeth exchanged a meaningful glance with Jacob. I have news that might explain that, she said, unable to contain her smile. We're expecting a baby in late summer. Mrs. Holloway's delighted exclamations brought other boarders running, and soon the news was spreading through town. By the time they'd visited the general store and the post office, it seemed everyone in Silverridge knew about the coming Galloway baby. So much for keeping it quiet until we were sure, Jacob said wryly as they drove home, the wagon loaded with supplies for the coming months. Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder. Are you upset? Jacob's arm tightened around her. How could I be upset about the whole town knowing I'm the proudest husband in Colorado territory? Spring came early that year, bringing with it renewed work on their house. Jacob hired 2 men from town to help with construction, determined to have the home finished before the baby arrived. Elizabeth's belly grew rounder as the house grew taller. By May, both were nearing completion. The 2-story home stood proud on the hill, its wide porch facing the valley below, windows gleaming in the spring sunshine. It's perfect, Jacob, Elizabeth said as they walked through the completed downstairs rooms. Jacob had spared no expense on the interior, ordering real glass windows and proper wood flooring instead of the packed earth many frontier homes made do with. The parlor boasted a brick fireplace, and the kitchen had the latest cast iron cookstove. Wait until you see upstairs, Jacob said, guiding her carefully up the new staircase. The master bedroom was spacious, with a large window overlooking the valley. But it was the smaller room adjacent that brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. Jacob had furnished it as a nursery, with a handcrafted wooden cradle in the center. I made it myself, he said, sounding almost shy. Been working on it in the evenings. Elizabeth ran her hands over the smooth wood, noticing the careful carving of leaves and vines along the sides. It's beautiful, Jacob, the most thoughtful gift. I want our child to have everything, Jacob said, his hand coming to rest on Elizabeth's rounded belly. Everything I didn't have growing up, everything you lost when you came west. Elizabeth covered his hand with hers. Our child already has everything that matters. 2 parents who love each other and will love him or her beyond measure. On a sweltering August day, Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine Grace Galloway. She had Jacob's blue eyes and a dusting of dark hair that Elizabeth was certain would curl just like her father's. She's perfect, Jacob whispered, cradling his daughter with hands that seemed too large and rough for such a delicate task, yet somehow held her with exquisite gentleness. She is, Elizabeth agreed, exhausted but filled with a joy so complete it brought tears to her eyes. That night, as moonlight streamed through the nursery window, Elizabeth watched Jacob rock their daughter to sleep, his deep voice softly singing a lullaby his mother had once sung to him. In that moment, the journey that had brought her west with all its hardship and loss seemed perfectly right, the necessary path to this happiness. 5 years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. The ranch prospered under Jacob's careful management, expanding to neighboring property when old man Simmons decided to return east. Catherine, or Katie as they called her, grew into a spirited child with her father's adventurous nature and her mother's quick mind. Elizabeth found unexpected fulfillment beyond motherhood. With Jacob's encouragement, she started a small school for the children of neighboring ranches, transforming one of the outbuildings into a classroom where she taught reading, writing, and arithmetic 3 days a week. You're a natural teacher, Jacob observed one evening as he helped her grade simple arithmetic papers. These children are lucky to have you. Elizabeth smiled, watching Katie play with Chester's puppies by the fireplace. The old dog had fathered a litter with a neighbor's hound, and Jacob hadn't been able to resist keeping 2 of the pups. I never would have discovered this talent in Boston. It's strange how life leads us where we're meant to be, even when the path seems wrong at first. Like a starving woman stumbling into a general store for bread, Jacob teased, reaching across the table to take her hand. Exactly like that, Elizabeth replied, her heart still warming at the memory. Have I ever properly thanked you for that day, Jacob Galloway? Every day, he said simply. Every single day. In the spring of Katie's 5th year, Elizabeth discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy proved more difficult than her first, with weeks of sickness that left her weak and worried. Should we send for the doctor from Denver? Jacob asked one night after she'd been unable to keep even broth down. Elizabeth shook her head. Dr. Matthews says it's normal, just more severe this time. It will pass. Jacob's brow remained furrowed with concern. I don't like seeing you suffer, Elizabeth. It's temporary, she assured him, though privately she shared his worry. For a wonderful cause. The sickness did eventually pass, but Elizabeth remained weaker than she'd been during her first pregnancy. Jacob insisted on hiring Mrs. Holloway's niece to help with the house and Katie, allowing Elizabeth to rest as much as possible. You're spoiling me, she protested when Jacob brought her breakfast in bed for the 3rd day running. Getting my money's worth, he replied with a wink. Remember that loaf of bread. I figure I'm still owed some interest on that investment. As winter approached, the baby began to make his presence known with vigorous kicks that sometimes took Elizabeth's breath away. Strong like his father, she said, placing Jacob's hand on her belly to feel the movement. Stubborn like his mother, more likely, Jacob countered, his face softening with wonder as the baby kicked against his palm. Another month to go, Elizabeth nodded. Dr. Matthews thinks early January, but the baby had other plans. On Christmas Eve, as a gentle snow fell outside the farmhouse windows, Elizabeth felt the first pains begin. By midnight, it was clear the baby was coming, and Jacob rode through the storm to fetch Dr. Matthews from town. The labor was long and difficult. Elizabeth, already weakened from the difficult pregnancy, struggled to find the strength for the final pushes. Jacob stayed by her side, his steady presence giving her courage when her body wanted to surrender. You can do this, he whispered, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. You're the strongest person I know, Elizabeth Galloway. With one final, monumental effort, Elizabeth brought their son into the world as the first light of Christmas Day broke over the eastern hills. James Jacob Galloway announced his arrival with a lusty cry that brought relieved tears to his father's eyes. He's perfect, Jacob said, his voice choked with emotion as the doctor placed the swaddled infant in his arms. Elizabeth, he's absolutely perfect. But Elizabeth's exhaustion was turning to something more concerning. The doctor's expression grew grave as he worked to stop bleeding that wouldn't cease. Jacob, she whispered, her face alarmingly pale against the pillows. Let me see him. Jacob brought their son to her, his heart clenching with fear at the weakness in her voice. Elizabeth touched the baby's cheek with trembling fingers. Hello, James, I've been waiting for you. Mrs. Galloway needs to rest now, doctor. Matthews said firmly, motioning for Jacob to take the baby and leave the room. The next hours were the longest of Jacob's life. He paced the parlor floor, his newborn son sleeping peacefully in the cradle while Katie, mercifully unaware of the gravity of the situation, played with her Christmas gifts under the watchful eye of Mrs. Holloway's niece. When Dr. Matthews finally emerged from the bedroom, his exhausted face broke into a smile. She's going to be all right. The bleeding has stopped. She's weak and will need extensive rest, but your wife is a fighter, Mr. Galloway. Jacob's legs nearly gave way with relief. Can I see her, briefly? She needs sleep more than anything now. Elizabeth lay pale but peaceful in their bed, her golden hair spread across the pillow like a halo. Her eyes fluttered open as Jacob approached, a small smile touching her lips. James, she whispered. Perfect and strong, Jacob assured her, taking her hand gently in his. Like his mother. I was afraid, she admitted, her voice barely audible, afraid I would leave you alone with our children. Jacob brought her hand to his lips. You didn't, you fought just like you've always fought. Rest now, my love, we have a lifetime ahead of us. Elizabeth's recovery was slow but steady. By spring, she was able to sit on the porch and watch Katie playing in the yard while she nursed baby James. The difficult birth had taken its toll, and Dr. Matthews warned that another pregnancy might be dangerous, but Elizabeth found she didn't mind. Their family felt complete, a son and daughter, healthy and strong. Penny for your thoughts, Jacob said, joining her on the porch one evening as the sunset painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "I was thinking about bread," Elizabeth replied with a smile, "and how sometimes the things we think we need lead us to the things we truly need." Jacob settled beside her, his arm around her shoulders, pretty philosophical for a ranch wife. Elizabeth leaned into his embrace. "I've had good teachers, life, loss." She looked up at him. Love, Jacob's eyes, still as blue as the day they'd met, crinkled at the corners. "Any regrets?" "About the path that brought you here," Elizabeth thought of Boston, of the life she might have had comfortable, predictable, safe. Then she looked at her children, her home, the man beside her who had saved her with a loaf of bread and an invitation that changed everything. "Not a single one," she said truthfully. "Every step led me exactly where I was meant to be." As the years passed, the Galloway Ranch became one of the most successful in Colorado. Jacob's innovative breeding techniques improved his herd, and his fair business practices earned him respect throughout the territory. Elizabeth's small school grew into a proper one-room schoolhouse that served children from miles around. Katie grew into a beautiful young woman with her father's head for business and her mother's love of learning. She shocked them both by announcing her intention to attend college in Denver, the first woman in the area to pursue higher education. "Are you sure about this?" Jacob asked as they prepared to take her to the city for her first term. "It's not too late to change your mind." Katie's determined expression was so like Elizabeth's that Jacob had to smile. "I'm sure, Father. I want to become a doctor. There's such a need for medical care out here, especially for women." Elizabeth squeezed her husband's hand. "She knows her own mind, Jacob, just like someone else I know." James grew tall and strong, with a natural affinity for the land that matched his father's. By 16, he was Jacob's right hand on the ranch, learning every aspect of the business with an enthusiasm that assured them the Galloway legacy would continue. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Jacob surprised Elizabeth with a trip to San Francisco, a place she'd often expressed curiosity about but never had the opportunity to visit. "Can we really leave the ranch for that long?" she asked, amazed by his gift. "James is more than capable of managing things for a month," Jacob replied. "And it's time we had an adventure together that doesn't involve childbirth or cattle." San Francisco dazzled them with its sophistication and energy. They attended the opera, dined in fine restaurants, and walked along the bay watching ships come and go from distant ports. For Elizabeth, who had once thought her travels ended in Silverridge, it was a revelation. "Thank you for this," she said as they stood on a hilltop overlooking the city, the wind whipping her skirts and loosening strands of hair that now held strands of silver among the gold. "For showing me there are still new horizons." Jacob, his own hair more salt than pepper now but his eyes as keen as ever, pulled her close. "There will always be new horizons for us, Elizabeth, as long as we face them together." On their last night in the city, as they prepared for bed in their hotel room, Jacob produced a small package from his luggage. "One more anniversary gift," he said, handing it to Elizabeth. She unwrapped it carefully to find a beautiful leather-bound journal. "It's lovely, Jacob." "Open it," he urged. Inside, on the first page, Jacob had written in his precise hand, "For Elizabeth, who came for bread and stayed for love, may our story continue for many chapters to come." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes as she traced his words. "Our story," she whispered. From such an unlikely beginning, Jacob took her in his arms, his embrace as strong and sure as it had been 25 years before. "The best stories often have unlikely beginnings," he said. "It's where they lead that matters." As they returned to their ranch, to their children and grandchildren, to the life they'd built together, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought her west. The loss and hardship, the hunger and uncertainty, all leading to that moment in Miller's General Store when a kind cowboy paid for her bread and changed her life forever. She had come to Colorado seeking her brother and found instead a home, a family, a purpose. Most precious of all, she had found Jacob, a man whose quiet strength and unwavering love had given her the courage to build a life far different from the one she'd imagined, but infinitely richer, and it had all begun with a loaf of bread. On their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even 2 great-grandchildren. Jacob and Elizabeth stood on the porch of the house he had built for her so long ago. Though their hair was now white and their steps slower, their eyes still held the same light when they looked at each other. "If you could go back," one of their granddaughters asked during the celebration, "would you change anything about your lives together?" Elizabeth looked at Jacob, at the face she had loved through youth and middle age, and now into their twilight years. She thought of the journey that had brought them together, the grief and hunger that had led her into Miller's General Store that summer day in 1878. "Not a single moment," she said, her hand finding Jacob's as it had thousands of times over their decades together. "Every step of the path was necessary to bring us here." Jacob's fingers tightened around hers, his smile still making her heart flutter after all these years. "Even the part where you were too proud to accept charity for a loaf of bread," Elizabeth laughed, the sound as youthful as the day they met. "Especially that part. Some things are worth more than their price." As the sun set over the Colorado hills they both loved so dearly, Jacob leaned down to whisper in her ear, "Best meal I never had, that bread." "Best invitation I ever accepted," Elizabeth whispered back, turning her face to meet his kiss, as sweet in that moment as their first had been 50 years before on a hilltop not far from where they now stood. Their story had begun with hunger and kindness, with 3 copper pennies and a loaf of bread. It had grown into a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone, in their children and their children's children, in the land they had nurtured together, in the community they had helped to build. And in the hearts of all who knew them, the tale would be told for generations. Of the proper Boston lady who came west seeking her fortune and found instead a cowboy with Shakespeare in his pocket and kindness in his heart. Of how she came to buy 1 loaf of bread and he paid and said, "Eat with me instead." And of how that simple moment changed everything.